There's a quiet tension that lives beneath the surface of many lives, not loud enough to name, not sharp enough to demand attention. It appears in moments of hesitation, in the pauses before speaking honestly, in the subtle pull toward a life imagined but never fully entered. Fear is often blamed for holding people back, but this fear is different. It does not come from danger, it comes from possibility. It arises when becoming more real would mean leaving behind what is familiar, when stepping forward would dissolve the carefully shaped self that once kept everything intact. Somewhere inside there's an unspoken knowing that the life being avoided is not foreign at all, it is deeply personal, and that recognition, more than any external threat, is what makes the fear feel so close, so intimate, so difficult to look at directly. There's a moment when fear reveals its true shape, not as panic, not as doubt, but as recognition. It shows up when life grows quiet enough to hear what has been waiting underneath, in the space between obligations, in the stillness after distractions lose their grip. Something inside begins to stir, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to be felt. It is the sense that there is more beneath the surface that has been carefully maintained. More honesty, more complexity, more life than has been allowed to breathe. This realization does not arrive with excitement, it arrives with unease. Because becoming more real is not simply an addition, it is a subtraction. It means loosening roles that once offered protection. It means releasing versions of the self that were shaped to belong, to be accepted, to survive quietly. The fear is rarely about what might go wrong, it is about what might change irrevocably. There's an unspoken awareness that stepping closer to one's own depth could disrupt relationships, routines, and the familiar identity that others have learned to recognize. That the self being approached may not fit neatly into the life already built, so that fear lingers, not as resistance, but as caution. It feels safer to remain partially known, to live just within the edges of what has already been proven acceptable, to keep the deeper impulses muted, not denied, just postponed. This is how the unlived self becomes a quiet presence rather than an expressed one. It watches patiently, it does not demand, it waits. And the waiting itself becomes heavy, because even avoidance carries awareness, even silence carries knowing. The fear then is not empty, it is full of meaning. It guards something tender, the parts of the self that have never been tested by the world, never shaped by response, never confirmed or rejected. To approach them would mean uncertainty. And uncertainty feels dangerous to a psyche trained to seek stability. So hesitation is chosen instead, not as failure, but as preservation. Yet beneath that preservation is a subtle tension, the feeling of standing near a threshold without crossing it, of sensing a truer alignment somewhere ahead, while remaining rooted in what has already been mastered. The fear does not accuse, it simply exists. A quiet signal that something real is waiting, and that recognizing it is already a form of closeness. Fear does not appear without history. It carries memory, even when the memory cannot be named. Long before the fear took its current form, there were moments when being fully visible felt unsafe, moments when expression was met with silence, or correction, or withdrawal. Nothing dramatic had to happen. Sometimes it was enough to notice that certain traits received warmth while others were ignored. That some emotions made the room feel smaller. That some truth shifted the atmosphere in ways that were difficult to repair. So the psyche learned to edit. Not consciously, not strategically, but instinctively. It learned which parts could stay forward and which parts needed to step back. Which questions were welcome. Which feelings created distance. Over time, this quiet editing became identity. The self that emerged was not false, it was adaptive. Shaped by the need to belong, guided by an early understanding that connection sometimes required restraint. Courage in this landscape did not feel heroic, it felt risky, because courage once meant exposure, and exposure once meant losing something important, approval, safety, closeness. So the nervous system remembers. Even in adulthood, when the external conditions have changed, the inner response remains attentive, alert to subtle threats, sensitive to moments where authenticity might cost more than it gives. The fear of becoming who one truly is often the fear of repeating an old rupture. Not because the outcome is certain, but because the memory of loss is deeply etched, and so the self stays partially hidden, not out of weakness, but out of loyalty, to a younger version that learned how to survive by staying contained. This is why the fear feels reasonable, why it resists being argued with, why it cannot be dismissed by logic. It is protecting something that once needed protection. Yet within this protection is a quiet contradiction. What once preserved connection now limits expression. What once ensured belonging now creates distance from the self. The psyche holds both truths at once. It remembers why the walls were built, and it senses that those same walls are now holding something essential inside. This tension is not a mistake. It is a natural result of growth outpacing the strategies that once kept everything intact. The fear, then, is not an enemy. It is a record, a living archive of moments when being fully seen felt like too much, and recognizing that history does not dissolve the fear, but it changes how it is understood, not as an obstacle, but as a trace of care that has not yet learned a new shape. There is a way the mind organizes itself around what is allowed to exist, around what can be shown, around what must remain unseen. Carl Jung spoke of the unlived parts of the psyche not as flaws, but as territories left unexplored. Not wrong, simply unknown. These parts do not disappear. They gather quietly in the background of the self. They wait in impulses that feel inconvenient, in longings that arrive without explanation, in discomfort that surfaces when life becomes too narrow. The fear is often strongest at the point of encounter, because meeting these hidden aspects does not feel like discovery. It feels like disruption. There's an inner resistance that arises, not loud but firm, a pullback toward the familiar, toward the identity that has already been validated by the world. The conflict is subtle. One part seeks continuity, another seeks wholeness. Neither is aggressive, neither is cruel. They simply want different kinds of safety. The familiar self wants predictability. The unlived self wants expression. And between them is a silence heavy with meaning. This is where fear becomes most misunderstood. It is often assumed to be a signal to stop, but internally it behaves more like a threshold, the sensation that something significant is nearby. Not good, not bad, just consequential. There comes a quiet realization, not as insight but as feeling, that the fear is not warning against becoming someone else. It is reacting to the loss of an old balance. Becoming more whole does not feel like expansion at first. It feels like disorientation, because the psyche must loosen its grip on certainty before it can hold complexity. This is why courage in this context feels strangely intimate. It is not about bold action. It is about allowing internal contradictions to exist without being resolved. The unlived self does not demand to be completed. It asks only to be acknowledged. And acknowledgement alone shifts something. Not dramatically, not visibly, but internally the fear begins to change texture. It is no longer just tension, it becomes information, a sign that the self is larger than the roles it has learned to perform. That identity is not fixed but layered. There is no moment of arrival here, no final alignment, only a softening, the sense that avoidance is no longer the only way to remain intact. And in that softened awareness, something settles. Not certainty, not peace, just a quieter relationship with the parts that were once kept at a distance. Enough to stand near them, enough to recognize them. And for now, that recognition is sufficient.